Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Paul Sweeney. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Joining us right now on these delicate issues in Russia with real-world experience, there is a photograph of Vladivostok, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is sort of West Japan.
Okay.
It's like Siberia and way out there. And Annmarie Hordern has some real deserved experience of Russia. And she joins us now here on the reported death of Alexey Navalny. I like what Wikipedia says, was a Russian opposition leader. Mm-hmm. That about sums it up in all that. Annmarie, before we get to Mr. Navalny's, the death here in the news, what's the number one thing Americans get wrong about Russia? You've lived it. What's the number one thing we get wrong?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel stumped at the moment.
You can't be stumped on radio. Be stumped on TV. You can't be stumped on radio. What's the answer? What do we get wrong?
Well, I feel like Russia, to almost understand it, you have to go there. But now it's very hard to understand because of the fact that we don't have these independent journalists working the same way. So it's kind of hard to understand where Russia is as a society now because of this. I think another thing people don't really understand about Russia is just it. You know, you alluded to this talking about Vladivostok. Vladivostok is on the border of with North Korea.
Yep.
The country is huge. So, you know, people think of Russians and they probably think of Moscow, but it's not. There's so many subcultures within Russia.
In the parts of the USSR, and some of that, of course, Mr. Putin wants to bring back with his memories of the 19th, or for that matter, the 15th century. Will we ever know the truth about the death of Mr. Navalny?
About this death, you know, potentially we won't. Obviously, I think you're alluding to the fact that everyone thinks that it was the Kremlin that ordered the killing of him at this moment.
But we don't have that reporting.
We don't have that reporting. But you know, his health could have been deteriorating regardless of whether or not this was purposeful, because he was in prison. What we do know is that most or all world leaders pretty much have blamed the Kremlin for when they tried to attack him last time with a nerve agent, and then he was airlifted to Germany, and then he said that this is my country, and he said he wanted to go back to Russia.
Let's review here, and I don't know the details. Annmarie's lived this again. South of London, Salisbury, there's two people sitting on a bench as a generalization, and they die from nerve whatever in the middle of one of the most bucolic, beautiful places in London. So I would say, Paul, there's exceptional, not distrust, but just there's a history here that gets you to this death this morning reported in Russia of Alexey Navalny.
And once again, Annmarie, this kind of brings back to the fore the Wall Street Journal reporter who's still being held in Russia. And I have to admit, the Wall Street Journal on a daily basis keeps that story literally front page.
As they should.
As they should. Do we have any knowledge of how that might play out? Because I know we've heard from the administration that remains a very top of the agenda issue for the administration, for the State Department, and certainly for the Wall Street Journal. What do we know the latest there?
So this is Evan Gershkovich. There's also another dual citizen, U.S. citizen, that is in from Radio Free Europe that is in prison as well in Russia. Putin alluded to this in that interview with Tucker Carlson.
Yeah,
I wish Tucker Carlson asked about Navalny. He didn't. But at least I don't believe he did, per the tape I saw. Putin said that, you know, he alluded to the fact that potentially there could be a deal, but he wants a swap. And the individual he's likely looking for is this person who is in prison for murder in Germany. So it'd mean the United States would have to get the Germans to agree to it. So it's very complicated, unlike it was with Brittany Griner when they had someone they were able to give. But so Putin will just hold on to Evan Gershkovich saying that, you know, he's a spy, when mostly everyone has said that is not true, and he will just use this as leverage.
We're gonna have to go here, but I just one more quick question here. I believe on our schedule, our wonderful team is looking at a conversation with Polish government officials next week. That's sort of on our surveillance date calendar. Where does Poland fit into this after their recent election? Where do they fit into the new Europe as they figure out how to fund a desperate Ukraine?
Well, what I find interesting this morning is the Financial Times' Ursula von der Leyen speaking to the FT.
The lead article.
Yeah, talking about they need to have subsidies to basically build an EU industrial base the same way they built into COVID vaccines, in the same way as a single market they went after natural gas. Poland would be on the side of agreeing with that. It borders Ukraine.
Right.
And it definitely wants a strong NATO, and it definitely wants the U.S. military bases to remain there.
Annmarie, thank you so much. Annmarie Hordern, of course, driving so much of our political coverage here. The first thing I did on the death of Mr. Navalny in Russia is say to our team, can you get me Angela's stent? She wrote a book a decade ago called Putin, which I read cover to cover in February a couple years ago to understand this guy. And Angela Stent owns the high ground. A student of Angela Stent, and also someone that owns the high ground, is Ariel Cohen, senior fellow, Atlantic Council. The last time he was on their Eurasia Center, he was just magnificent. Dr. Cohen, on short notice today, thank you so much. What does the death of Mr. Navalny mean for Mr. Putin?
It's a watershed event. This can be compared with the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., or imagine if in South Africa, Nelson Mandela were to be murdered while in jail. But we'll see a very different reaction. Whereas in our country or in South Africa, there would have been an explosion of popular anger. In Russia, there's going to be none. Russia became under Putin, and I was there literally with Angela and other colleagues meeting Putin many times in a framework called the Valdai Club. Once a year we would go and meet with him, and increasingly we saw a man who controlled more and more of that society. Right. But also the murder of Navalny not only highlights how totalitarian Russia is becoming, but that there's no other person of that stature to replace him. My good friend, Boris Nemtsov in Russian pronunciation, was murdered in 2014, also in February, 10 years ago.
Right.
And since then, Russia was decapitated, Russian opposition was decapitated. And Alexei was a very brave man, because after speaking up his mind, he was poisoned, as we remember, was flown to Germany, miraculously saved from the poison. And then he decided to go back and continue to fight.
Right.
And they just couldn't tolerate having him in jail. Ariel, and I do believe that he was killed.
Ariel Cohen, this is just so important, and I think of a conversation with the giant Marshall Goldman. Goldman on air with Bloomberg surveillance folks in tears, live from Moscow, the day where he said there was a shift and Putin took over. How do we respond, not to the Putin that Marshall Goldman knew on that day, but how do we respond to this modern Putin?
I think there is a real and present danger. I don't want to be overly dramatic and say it's a mortal danger. We heard 2 days ago the leak from Congress that Russia is deploying a potent anti-satellite weapon in space. Probably is going to violate the space treaty that prevents deployment of satellite weapons and nuclear weapons in space. I do believe Putin is preparing to broaden the war beyond Ukraine. And in the meantime, we're having a circus in Washington where a small part of the Republican congressional delegation, is articulating arguments they hear from Tucker Carlson and from Donald Trump, and try to appease Putin We saw this movie in the late 1930s and in 1940 towards another dictator in Europe, and it ended up in a world war.
Yep. Dr. Cohen, I think when we saw this news today about Navalny, a lot of us thought about the Wall Street Journal reporter there and others that are being held there. Any update on how that might develop, that particular, because that's so high profile?
Putin is increasingly, as they say, costume playing the Cold War, and his two idols are Stalin and Hitler, believe it or not.
Wow.
You would think that any modern person would not keep Stalin and Hitler as his models for emulation. I think we may see an exchange of Ivan Gershkovich for a Russian spy somewhere in the equivalent of a bridge between the East and West Berlin.
Ariel, this is so important what you're saying here. How close are we to the middle 30s or the late 1930s? The language
I would say late.
Yeah, the language from you on Stalin, on Hitler, and we're in Washington with a new isolationism that's extraordinary. Is there an analog to 1938?
Today, yes, I think we are. I think, God willing, it can be resolved, but the chances are going down. I think Putin made a decision based on his observation of America, of Western Europe, that we're weak, that we can be pushed around, and a late great Russian political consultant, Gleb Pavlovsky, whom I knew very well, who worked for Putin for many years and then parted ways with him around 2008, kept writing and saying to me personally and to others that the only way the Putin regime knows is escalation.
Yep.
And we see it. We see it in Georgia, in Ukraine in 2014, in Ukraine in 2022, in leaked war plans against the Baltic states now. And I think unless we restore our deterrence, the worst case scenario may play out in Europe.
Dr. Cohen, thank you so much. We know you've got to go off to other important meetings with the Atlantic Council. Dr. Ariel Cohen there, just a fabulous moment on what we witness in Russia. Again, thanks to Annmarie Hordern today earlier for her perspective. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.